Good morning, everyone. Today's presentation is on the topic of human trafficking, the impact on our workforce. The presentation will provide you with a basic overview of human trafficking, tactics used by labor traffickers to recruit victims, indicators for victim identification, and tools for providing support to victims of human trafficking. When we begin talking about human trafficking, there are always certain myths that surface. A few include trafficking victims are always foreign nationals, sex trafficking is the only form of human trafficking, trafficking requires border crossing, trafficking victims must be kidnapped or physically restrained. During today's workshop, we will provide you with information that will dispel these myths. So, what is human trafficking? Human trafficking is a form of modern day slavery that involves the exploitation of persons for commercial sex or forced labor, including the inability for the victim to extricate themselves from the situation. Please note that for the purpose of today's workshop, we will focus primarily on labor trafficking. Human trafficking can occur for the purposes of involuntary servitude, which refers to being forced through coercion to work for another person or persons, peonage, and debt bondage, which means being forced to work to pay off a debt and or slavery. Human trafficking can include, but does not require, movement. People may be considered trafficking victims if they are trafficked in their hometown. Traffickers use force, fraud, and coercion to control their victims. So why is it important that we in Florida have a good understanding of this topic? Florida is a hub for human trafficking activity due to its large agricultural industry and tourism-based economy. According to the Florida State University Center for Advancement of Human Rights, the largest sex trafficking and labor trafficking cases in the U.S. have occurred in Florida. Now, to fit the federal definition of trafficking, the labor trafficking situation must have an action, meaning the recruiting, the harboring, the transporting, the providing, or obtaining a means of force, fraud, or coercion, and be for the purpose of forced labor. Now, who are the traffickers? The traffickers can be organized crime members, friends and acquaintances, family members and relatives, business owners, and agricultural operations. But there are also lone individuals, intimate partners, factory owners, gangs, corporations, pimps, and returnees. Now, returnees are the individuals who return to a country or state, and in some cases of human trafficking, these individuals return to re-engage in criminal activity. Although it is estimated that 70% of victims are women, anyone can be a victim of human trafficking. Additionally, there are certain individuals who are considered vulnerable and therefore more susceptible to trafficking. Individuals with limited financial means, people living with disabilities, young and older individuals, people with low literacy skills or education, and individuals with limited English proficiency. LEP individuals may not disclose the situation due to language and/or cultural barriers. Individuals in certain cultures have the belief that what happens here remains here. People from other countries, because many trafficking victims from other countries may be here illegally, they fear U.S. authorities. Traffickers then exploit this fear. Further, they may not realize they are victims or that they have rights under U.S. law. We can also have people within the U.S., for example, homeless individuals, individuals engaged in sex industry, as well as students. So where are victims of trafficking found? Labor trafficking victims can be found working in occupations or industry that are labor intensive or low skill, such as restaurants and food service, bars, hotels and hospitality, commercial cleaning services, food processing, agricultural work, factory labor, construction work, or begging and street peddling. However, you may also find victims who are doing domestic work or childcare, health or beauty services, carnival, landscaping, forestry, and even logging. Traffickers have also utilized the U.S. Department of Labor's Foreign Labor Certification Program to exploit victims. The Foreign Labor Certification Programs, specifically the H-2A program, is a visa program that allows employers to bring non-immigrant foreign workers to the United States to work agricultural work on a temporary or seasonal nature when it can be demonstrated that there is a shortage of willing and available workers to perform the work. Traffickers may recruit or hire persons and bring them to the U.S. by means of materially false or fraudulent pretenses, representations, or promises regarding their employment. Later in the presentation, we will discuss important indicators that will help you identify when this may be occurring so that you may be appropriately able to report suspected issues to me as the SMA. Over the past 5 years, the utilization of the H-2A program has been increasing year over year. As you can see from the slide, the highest number of labor certifications for the H-2A program are issued here in Florida. So if we think about the agricultural labor market in terms of labor, of a labor chain that stretches multiple countries and economies, we can see that exploitation and coercion for a victim of labor trafficking can be centralized, or it can occur at any point along the H-2A process continuum, from the local recruitment event to supervision out in the fields. Of course, this could look very different for workers, meaning citizens or undocumented individuals who are already in the U.S., but there are nodes on the continuum that would be applicable to them as well. So now let's look at forced labor. Migrants are particularly vulnerable to this form of human trafficking, but individuals also may be forced into labor in their own countries. Female victims of forced labor, especially women and girls in domestic servitude, are often sexually abused or exploited as well. Once a person's labor is exploited by such means, the employer becomes the trafficker and the worker becomes a trafficking victim. Workers may fall victims of traffickers who unlawfully exploit an initial debt assumed, wittingly or unwillingly, as a term of employment. Traffickers, labor agencies, recruiters, and employers in both the transit state and the destination state can contribute to debt bondage by charging workers recruitment fees and exorbitant interest rates, making it difficult, if not impossible, to pay off a debt. A transit state is a state by which a victim of trafficking is trafficked until he or she reaches the destination state. So I'll give you an example. A trafficker is going to transport a trafficking victim in Florida to the state of North Carolina. In this example, Florida, Georgia, and South Carolina are the transit states. North Carolina is the destination state. It's important to remember that many aspects of labor trafficking and labor exploitation are similar, and both involve exploitative working conditions. The main difference between labor trafficking and labor exploitation is that in trafficking situation, there are elements of force, fraud, and coercion, and limited freedom of movement. It can be a little bit more difficult to tell if someone can really leave in many visa-sponsored situations because the visa is typically tied to one employer and workers do not have the option to seek other employment with a different employer and keep their visa. So now let's look at some of the tactics used by labor traffickers. So how are victims of trafficking recruited? They're recruited by family members or acquaintances, newspaper ads, fake employment agencies, recruiters, front businesses, by word of mouth, and by abduction. Traffickers may use various methods of force, fraud, and coercion. They may use one, all, or a combination of these methods. The slide illustrates examples of some of the tactics used by traffickers to force people to work against their will. The threats of deportation and blacklisting, the confiscation of documents, the physical violence of threats, the threats to harm family members in home countries, debt bondage, earning being withheld or wage theft, isolation, the denial of wants and needs, and also emotional and verbal abuse. So, what are some of the indicators for victims? Victims of trafficking are rarely going to self identify as such. Therefore, it is very important that we understand the various indicators that will aid in identifying potential victims. Disclosure may not happen due to many factors, including the fear of retaliation against the victim or relatives, the fear of being deported. The victim may not understand that he or she is being trafficked, and fear of law enforcement. The general indicators of labor trafficking include the living and working conditions of a victim, victims who may lack personal items or forms of identification, the physical indicators, and the labor camps or sweatshops. The next several slides will review each of these indicators more specifically. So let's look at the living and working conditions. Victims may be identified based upon their living and working conditions. Outreach workers must be observant of the working and living conditions of MSFWs when conducting outreach. The victims may live on or near the work premises. They may be charged rent or have rent money taken out of the paycheck in order to deepen the debt bondage. Inhumane living or working conditions may be observed, such as living condition exposed to the elements, lacking running water, plumbing, and electricity. The traffickers will restrict or control their communication. Victims are often kept in isolation by traffickers because they fear the victim may disclose their situation to others. Traffickers are often in close proximity to their victims as a way to exert power over them. You may note the victims are frequently moved by the traffickers, which causes the victims to be unfamiliar with their surroundings. This increases their dependence on the traffickers. Lastly, a large number of victims may be residing in the same living space. An outreach worker may observe overcrowding conditions, such as mattresses on the floor or excessive coming and going of workers to a particular room. The victims may lack personal items, cell phones or calling cards, private space, financial records, and transportation. So not having personal documents increases the victim's fear of being deported or reported to law enforcement. Victims may also show signs of injury, branding, and malnutrition. Unfortunately, victims often do not seek or are not allowed to seek medical care by the traffickers. And the slide shows some of the examples of personal or physical indicators. The labor camps. Security intended to keep the victims confined can include barbed wire, bars or outside locks on windows and doors, self-contained camps, bouncers or guards and or guard dogs. They can have blacked out windows, security cameras, high walls, and victims only allowed to shop at the company store. Now, other indicators are going to be someone else having possession of the legal or travel documents, debts that are supposedly owed to a boss or the handler, or one attorney claiming to represent multiple illegal aliens detained at different locations, or having a third party who is always insisting on interpreting. You can also have H-2A workers charge the recruitment fees to come to the United States, the employer who's withholding the documents that pertain to the workers not getting paid, or H-2A workers not working at the site location indicated under their contract. And you can also have H-2A workers not living in approved housing. So how can we support victims of human trafficking? There are several critical elements for supporting victims of trafficking. The first element is effective communication with potential or actual victims. The second element is gaining their trust. The first two elements will allow you to couple your awareness of the indicators with your ability to glean additional information from the potential or actual victim so you know what to do. Knowing what to do also includes referring victims to available resources. So the first thing that I would recommend to anyone engaging with a victim is not to pressure them to talk. Keep in mind that they may not be comfortable talking to you because they have been pressured against talking to any authorities. If they do open up, start where they're at and with the issues they are willing to talk about. Build rapport and trust from there. It is also important that you speak to the victim in a safe and private location so that you do not raise suspicion. The person accompanying the victim could be the trafficker posing as a spouse, a family member, or the employer. When communicating with a possible victim, it's important to listen to what they are disclosing. If you need to take notes for documentation purposes, explain why you're taking the notes and remember to ask for permission first. Use the same words the person is using and don't correct them, especially as they refer to the situation. If the possible victim is open to communicating, they may share narratives or stories that you are unfamiliar with. Maintain an open mind and continue to actively listen. Lastly, limit the number of staff members who come in contact with the victim. Too many people may be intimidating for the victim or raise the trafficker's suspicion. Maintaining confidentiality is crucial when working with victims of trafficking. You may be the first person a victim discloses the information to. It is also important due to safety concerns of the victim and others. You will also want to assure the victim that you are there to help, that their safety is your top priority, and that there are resources available to them. The Trafficking Victim Protection Act, the TVPA, they do provide protection for trafficking victims that enable them to provide them and obtain medical care, witness protection, housing assistance, and other social services. It also allows for civil remedies for financial detriment that they have suffered. When applicable, temporary legal immigration status is also available if they are willing to work with law enforcement. It's also important not to make promises that you can't keep. We have to remember that victims of human trafficking experience trauma due to the abuse that they have suffered at the hands of the trafficker. Therefore, trust is very important for victims. If you say you're going to do something, make sure it is a promise that you can keep. In addition to the indicators for identification that we've discussed during the workshop, asking the right questions can also help you identify a potential victim. Here are some of the examples of the questions that you can ask. Can you leave your job if you want? When you are not working, can you come and go as you please? Have you been threatened with harm if you try to quit? Has anyone threatened your family? What are your working or living conditions like? Where do you eat and where do you sleep? Do you have to ask permission to eat, sleep, or go to the bathroom? Is there a lock on your door or windows so that you can get out? So, know what to do. Assist the victim with filing a complaint with the local center, especially the Employment and Service Related Law Complaint Specialist. Contact your local Human Trafficking Task Force or coalition to request further assistance. And also notify me immediately if there is any suspected human trafficking activity in the service area. Establishing relationships in the community is critical in order to advocate on behalf of trafficked victims. Establish these relationships in advance to better assist victims of trafficking. This slide contains 2 resource guides or directories that can aid you in identifying partners and resources for providing assistance to victims of trafficking. The first is a statewide resource developed by the Florida State Center for the Advancement of Human Rights, and the second is a resource for Southwest Florida, developed by the Human Trafficking Resource Center at Florida Gulf Coast Center. So one of the most important ways to support victims of human trafficking is to apprise them of the resources available to them. The slide lists a variety of resources that I encourage you to become familiar with. The first resource, the National Human Trafficking Hotline, is a national 24-hour anti-trafficking hotline serving the United States and the U.S. territories. The hotline provides human trafficking victims, survivors, or allies with access to critical support and services to get help and stay safe. It also equips the anti-trafficking community with tools to effectively combat all forms of human trafficking. So it's a good idea to pass the hotline's contact information to anyone that you suspect could be exploited, even if you are not quite sure that it is trafficking. This gives them the option of reaching out on their own when they are ready, even if they are not yet comfortable talking to you about the situation. The last slide in the presentation has my contact information. If you needed to reach me, you can reach me at the main line at DO. That phone number is 850-921-3372. You can also contact me via email. My email is minerva.figueroa@deo.myflorida.com. Thank you so much.